Hello, it's Professor Fred Long again. We're looking at participles. In chapter 18 here, we're going to be looking at the formation of the middle passive and middle participles. Chapter 17 was about the active formations and the aorist passive, which used active endings. But now we're going to pick up the aorist middle and the present middle passive and the perfect middle passive formations of the participle. We'll then look at a summary of the participle forms. It's important to see the patterns, and then we'll have a guide for translating adjectival and circumstantial participles. We'll kind of pull this all together, and we'll talk briefly about marking, and then also very briefly about apokryma, which is used to take back control of a conversation. Let's start, though, with vocabulary. Here we have more second declension nouns. To therion, wild beast. To hieron, temple or holy place. To imation, garment. To mnemeon, tomb. To pedion, child. To plion, boat. To prosopon, face or appearance. To sabbaton, Sabbath or rest. To semion, sign or mark. Masculine nouns include o thronos, throne, chair or seat. O karpos, fruit or produce. O lithos, stone. O naos, temple or sanctuary. O phobos, fear. And o chronos, time or occasion. So after learning this vocabulary, you will know 75% of the words in the Greek New Testament. Be sure to read the notes on vocabulary, and let's look at the formation of the middle passive and middle participles. These participles are easy to form and parse. Basically, they use the first and second declension endings. These are 2-1-2 adjectives formations. The masculine and neuter use the second declension, and the feminine use the first declension. You have a coupling syllable, which is really big. For the present middle passive, it's omen. Omenos, omenu, omeno, omenon. Omenu, omenon, omenus, omenus. Then for the feminine, omene, omenes, omene, omenane, omene, omenon, omenes, omenas. You can see those forms. So very simple to learn. For the present middle passive form, what you do is simply add these endings onto the verb stem. Now the aorist middle participle is very simple to form. You just simply have to understand its coupling syllable. And rather than omen, it's samen. So samenos, samenu, sameno, samenon. So very simple. These endings are set up very nicely with this coupling syllable, or really here it's a coupling suffix and coupling vowel with a tense formative, really. Samen, it's not just a syllable, it's a couple syllables, samenos. And then the feminine, samene, and then the neuter, samenon. So this is the aorist middle formation. The perfect middle passive formation is similar in pattern. Notice that there's no coupling vowel here. You just have this syllable, this tense suffix syllable. This is characteristic of the middle passive perfect formation. If you look at the indicative mood, there was no coupling vowel at all. And so the endings were just abutted right onto the end of the verb. And so you can see the endings there, pretty simple. One other thing that happens is that the accent is retained on this second to last syllable, even though, according to verb rules generally, the accent would want to go to this syllable here. This is a characteristic of the perfect tense formation, retaining the accent. Here's a chart in 18.2 of all the participle forms. This will give you an overview of the coupling syllable and the type of declension ending and other notes and features. So these participle forms while they are many, actually are just recycling and reusing endings that you already know. So if you just take some principles of the tense formatives along with understanding the coupling vowel, then it's just a matter of understanding and recognizing the endings that you already know so well. Let's talk about translating adjectival and circumstantial participles. First, you need to recognize the difference between broad usages. You need to understand that there are adjectival participles, which are often going to be articular. That is, they're going to have an article form with them. And then circumstantial participles are always unarthrous. That is, they will never have the article with them. And then there's going to be some specialized participle uses that we'll look at in the next couple chapters. The second thing to consider is the significance of verbal aspect. Present indicates imperfective aspect, where the action is seen as ongoing or time simultaneous to the main verb. The aorist tense, particularly with circumstantial participles, is time prior. It indicates action viewed as a whole, as complete or completed. And the perfect indicates stative aspect with complex action and a resultant state, whether in past or present time frame. That's kind of dependent on the context. So adjectival participles in translation try to render the time contemporaneous or progressiveness of the present tense participle when it's used adjectively. That's sometimes hard to do. So in this example, o akuon, ton logon, this would be a substantive participle. It'd be the one that is hearing my word has life, or simply the one hearing. Notice that the difference between the two is the addition of this demonstrative, well, really it's a relative pronoun, that, with the helping verb is. And to use that is helps to convey an ongoing, progressive, contemporaneous sense to the participle. Now, the time value is always relative to the main verb. So here, in this case, the main verb is present tense, and so is hearing would be used to indicate time simultaneous or contemporaneous with the main verb. If we had switched this to had, then we might want to change this to the one that was hearing had life. So the time of the main verb is an indicator of how to render time simultaneous, or if you have an aorist participle and it might be time prior, the time prior of that participle. So here we have an example where you have an attributive participle. You have you mathe te, you blepontes. And the blepontes is functioning adjectively, seeing, it means seeing, and it refers to the disciples that see, that are seeing. Well, it's a present tense participle, and it tends to be time simultaneous. In this case, the verb apelthon is aorist indicative and translated in past time, departed. So to get this present tense participle as time simultaneous or contemporaneous with the main verb, we use the helping word were. The disciples that were seeing him departed. Now the aorist tense tends to indicate time prior. And if the main verb is in the present tense, then we can use a simple past. But if the main verb is a past time, then we have to use a pluperfect past time. So let's look at some examples here. So here we have the one that heard, o akusas ton logon mu eki zoe. So here the main verb is present tense, but we're looking at an aorist substantive participle, the one hearing. Now notice that the one hearing is rather vague in terms of time sequence, but if we were to try to render it as time prior, we would need to use the relative pronoun that, and then render the aorist participle in past time. So the one that heard my word has life. Or if we unmark the translation for time, we would say the one hearing my word has life. So in this case, verbal aspect or time is not evident. In this case, the main verb is past time in this example. So you have the disciples that saw him departed. So you could also render it as the disciples having seen him departed. And in this case, you use the helping verb having with then a past passive form of the verb in English to see, which is seen, in order to render this in a way that seems to be time prior. The disciples having seen him departed. Now, the perfect tense participle is hard to translate in a way that conveys adequately and smoothly the resultant effects that the perfect tense form signifies by its verbal aspect. So here's a couple of examples. The one that had been in a state of death came out. Now that's rather cumbersome to translate this. This is from the verb thenesko, to be dead. So the one having been in a state of death, or the one that had been in a state of death, came out. Here, there is some time relativeness of this, since the main verb is past indicative, that is aorist indicative, past time. You put the resultant effect relative to that past time and use the helping verb had to set that up. Now, in this case, you have a substantive, the ones that have believed in God. Here we use the relative pronoun that to translate that statement. So the ones believing in God. See, the ones believing in God would be vague in terms of verbal aspect. What kind of aspect is it? The ones believing, that could be present tense, could possibly be aorist tense. And so we have a perfect tense, and that's hard to render in English in such a way that it's clear that they have believed, and then there's a continuing resultant effect on them, and that's what's conveyed by the perfect tense. So try your best, and I've given you some suggestions here how to render that. Here's a summary chart of ways to indicate relative time with the participles depending on the time frame of the main verb. Again, this is a general guideline. There's always going to be contextual indicators that will delimit and lead you to one translation as opposed to another. Inherently, we must remember always that the participle is unmarked for time, and that the sense of time is only at best relative, and these are some ways, some strategies I've given you to render them in that way. Circumstantial participles, remember, are participles that don't have an article and are modifying the main verb. They're providing more information about what the subject has done or why they're doing it, or some particulars of what they're doing, and the participle signals and provides that information. Prenuclear placement with present tense participles tends to indicate time contemporaneous. One word that you can use to help set up that translation is while, and you can look at my examples. In a similar way, aorist tense participles in prenuclear position tend to indicate time prior, that is, events that have happened prior to the main verb, and a conjunction that can help set that up is, in English, the temporal conjunction after. Once again, the perfect tense participle is somewhat difficult to render in such a way that you effectively stress the stative or resultative impact of that participle. The helping conjunction after may be good, the conjunction after may be helpful, and you can see that example there. So here is a guide to prenuclear temporal adverbial participle translation using while and after. And this is for temporal participle translation. Not all prenuclear circumstantial participles will be temporal adverbial. but this is just a guide to get you going. Now, post-nuclear placement would entail often a description of particulars or particular aspects of the main verb. And there may be various adverbial relationships that would arise as possibilities from the sense of the logic of what's happening. Remember that the participle itself does not mark those adverbial relationships, but those must come from the sense of the context and the meaning of the words involved. And so here's some words that can indicate time, temporal relations, purpose, substantiation, concession, condition. These are conjunctions that help communicate those adverbial relationships in English. And you can see the different examples here. So we need to be careful about over-translating circumstantial participles. They're very dynamic and they're liable to over-interpretation. In other words, if we insist too much that they must mean this adverbial sense, then we've over-interpreted the participle because in fact they're unmarked for adverbial meaning. And we must use contextual indicators to guide us. And Greek will often add adverbs to help solidify and guide readers or the audiences originally to particular adverbial senses if in fact they wanted to convey them. Another category of participle use is called attendant circumstances or imperatival. These are possible categories of use. Attendant circumstance is when the participle is thought to describe a different independent action, but one that is often related and often prior in sequence to the main verb. For translation, it has been advised, although I disagree, that one translate the participle as a regular verb adding an and to make it form a compound sentence. So what happens here is that they make two main verbs, but my concern is that this obscures the fact that an author has chosen to subordinate one action by rendering it as a participle, a circumstantial participle, to the main verb. And so to translate those as two equal finite or main verbs is problematic and obscures the underlying grammar. I think it's best just to treat these as circumstantial participles. You can read and look at those examples there. Another questionable category is the imperatival participle, what's called the imperatival participle. Now, we've not learned the imperative mood yet, but the imperative mood is one of command and exhortation. And so there are places where participles are used that seem to be command forms. But I think from context, we may be able to supply an implied form of the verb imi, or rightly understand the participle as in fact circumstantial. So you can read that discussion there. Finally, be sure to look at the checkpoint, which will exercise your ability to recognize and analyze and translate participles. In terms of marking and diagramming participles, you need to treat them according to how they're functioning in the sentence. So if they're functioning adjectively, they're going to be working with a noun or forming their own noun, and look at the case to guide how you might mark it. So if it's a subject or nominative working as a subject, then you would single underline it. Otherwise, if it's a circumstantial participle, you would want to set it up, mark it as with brackets indicating a subordinate clause. And so you have to understand the parameters of that clause and set up the brackets accordingly. Now, one convention that might help you is to recognize that the participle itself may have its own direct object. And to indicate that direct object, you can use a vertical double line to separate it from the rest of the clause or phrase that it might be forming. So in this case, you have a command, bless the ones cursing you. The ones cursing you is an adjectival participle that's functioning substantively. It's forming its own noun, but it's also the direct object of the verb bless. But at the same time, it also has its own direct object. And so to differentiate the participle as a direct object from its own direct object, use a vertical double line to separate the two, because they're each going to receive a double underline to indicate a direct object. In terms of semantic diagramming, you align the participle as a modifier. So what is it modifying? If it's modifying a noun, you align it underneath or above that noun. If it's modifying the verb functioning as a circumstantial participle, then you align it underneath the verb. You can see this example here where the participles are marked accordingly, lining up with what they modify. Again, for circumstantial participles in the marking method, you use brackets. So in this example, one thing I know, that although I was blind, now I see, the phrase tu flos on is the circumstantial participle clause, and you put that inside of brackets. Remember that you can start to number the subordinate clauses by the brackets to help differentiate them. Finally, let's look at taking control or answering back in conversation. This concerns the verb apokrinome. Now, you've already learned the verb apokrinome earlier on, and you've been introduced to this verb and its lexical meaning. But I've been waiting to really talk about its function to take control of a conversation or a circumstance. And one way to translate that is to translate it as answering back. Now, when I learned this verb, I learned it as meaning I answer, and then that it took the dative case. But if you translate it as I answer back, the dative case that's found with it is quite naturally the indirect object. Now, another way to translate it, which is a little bit softer, is I respond to. The important thing to see here, though, is that this verb is used when there's a dialogue between persons, and the person who is described using this verb is going to take the conversation in a particular direction and slightly change the direction or try to take control of the conversation. Now, sometimes the taking control is in response to an event. So the disciples, like Peter, for example, in view of the transfiguration event, responds. He responds to it and tries to take control of the situation and speaks to Jesus and asks him, hey, should we set up some tents here? So it's interesting to look at how Peter responds to an event and tries to control the situation. More often, though, this verb is used to respond to someone in speech acts. And the reason why it's introduced here and given more elaboration is because the form will often be the aorist passive form and used as a circumstantial participle or a redundant participle in some respects, because it seems to be redundant to the main verb of speaking. However, it's not really redundant because of this pragmatic use, this function of this verb to indicate taking control back in the conversation. Be sure to read my notes on the importance for exegesis. I've had a lot of fun working through the book of Luke and noting when this is used, and it's been really illuminating at times to understand the dynamics of exchange and dialogue. Be sure to look at the case in point, which looks at some participles in Matthew 8:14.